Bueno, pues buenos días a todos.
Good morning. On behalf of Fundación Telefónica, I would like to welcome you to this space of Fundación Telefónica, and I would like to thank you for being
Otoñal de forma presencial y saludamos también a todos aquellos que nos están siguiendo a través de streaming. En el ciclo que inauguramos hoy y que supone la continuación de las jornadas que celebramos allá por mayo de 2012 con esta misma temática. Mi nombre es Rosa María Sainz y soy gerente de gestión de conocimiento en Fundación Telefónica. En esta nueva edición del Transmedia Living Lab nos mantenemos fieles al espíritu de exposición de las últimas tendencias en el mundo de las narrativas transmedia, con la vocación que siempre ha tenido de compartir y divulgar conocimiento y realizar una labor prospectiva de lo que está por venir. Mantenemos el formato habitual que caracteriza el evento. En los próximos 2 días combinaremos ponencias con mesas redondas y talleres que realizaremos por la tarde y dedicaremos cada día a un tema o a un aspecto diferente. Hoy nos vamos a focalizar en el storytelling transmedia, porque las historias siguen siendo el corazón y el núcleo de los proyectos. Y para ello contamos con ponentes nacionales e internacionales de primera línea a quienes queremos agradecer su participación con nosotros. Van a debatir sobre las nuevas formas que están adoptando los relatos y nos van a presentar los cambios que están surgiendo en los modelos de producción y de consumo. Mañana vamos a explorar un tema que va a dar mucho que hablar en los próximos años, la experiencia de usuario. En esta exploración escucharemos momentos únicos y personalizados, algo que se despunta como una de las características más importantes de las narrativas del futuro. Quisiera destacar en esta jornada una original y sorprendente experiencia sensorial que vamos a tener y a la que les invitamos a participar.
Help all the participants know what we're talking about. And last, on Friday we'll devote to Transmedia in Spain, what's been done and what's still to be done. To do so, we'll have 3 very important actors around the topic, and next they will have a debate around the different possible development. In a summary, we're going to take a look at a snapshot of a transmedia narrative, looking at the future to try to understand where we're at and where we're going to. And without further say, we have the presence of the writer, designer, and researcher, Christian Dane, who will talk about transmedia narratives in the next generation. And she's going to be introduced by Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Rosa.
Thank you, Rosa. I want to thank all of you for being here to Telefónica. I want to thank Telefónica for organizing the event and supporting us once more. To be here, share knowledge and experiences. Our experience shows that this is just a breeding ground. And I don't want to elaborate any further. I'm going to give the floor to Christy, who's I'm sure is going to tell very interesting things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just check if we need to log in. No, I think it'll be okay. Presenter view. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite to come over here. I am delighted to be here in Madrid. This is just my 2nd time in Spain, and it's very beautiful once again. And I hope to spend some time not only seeing as many of my colleagues that are here as possible, but also seeing the wonderful town. So thank you very much again for the invite. A quick question about the audience here. How many of you are students? Yes, that's the rebel corner over there. Yes, professionals who work in the, yeah, so we have a mix of both. Anyone want to put their hand up to represent anything other? Okay, okay, we can talk afterwards about what that means. So thank you again for the invite. What I've chosen to speak about today is the changing mind of working in a transmedia space and just a new narrative space in general. The changes of mind that I have gone through, the different ways that I perceive transmedia, and the way other people have gone through as well. And with that, I feel a responsibility for there being a reason for dismantling some of the views that I have had about transmedia and others have had about transmedia. It is not given just purely as a bit of fun wielding a hammer. It is actually because I believe that it's an important part of the process of understanding the form and allowing our creativity. So I'll step through some elements that I've also spoken about in my thesis, which is part of the beginning of the forming of transmedia. A lot of you will be familiar with Henry Jenkins and the work that he has done, and he was here 2 years ago and he gave a wonderful talk then. And during that time, Henry and a lot of us were working on defining exactly what transmedia is. And one of the things that we came up with at the time was the no repurposing argument. And that's the idea that whenever you're putting the same bit of information in another media channel, that doesn't count as transmedia. So for instance, if you've made a television show and it's available for viewing on your mobile phone, then that immediately is not transmedia. And there was a reason for that, and that's because this multi-channel distribution was actually being put forward as being a type of storytelling, if you like, and when there are competitions or special showcases of transmedia works, these were being put forward, which were then pushing out the people that were actually trying to do something interesting on the storytelling side. And so it was important to actually say that transmedia is not about distribution of media across channels. However, there is something that we lose when we create this blanket rule. And I'd like to bring an example here from an early intermedia work in the late 1960s. This piece called The Seventh Investigation by Joseph Kossuth. And with that, there was a repeat of some text. So there were six sentences reading, I'll just flick to the next one, to assume a mental set voluntarily, to grasp the essential of a given whole, for instance, to generalize. And these pieces of text were repeated in four different locations. So there was an image of the text at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There was text in a billboard in Chinatown, which is the image that you can see up there. There was a banner in Turin, in Italy, and there was also an advertisement of the text in the Daily World newspaper. So here, it is not just a case of distribution to get the same word out. The choice of medium was actually a part of the message. It was a discussion of how we can have parts and how they can come together, a question of the placement of this within a gallery juxtaposed with the placement of it on an advertising billboard. So the medium was part of the message here. So that is where we need to be careful of the blanket rule of no repurposing. Another example here, this is a work from the Pervasive Media Studio in the UK, in Bristol, I'm pretty sure they are, David, yep. And they did an experiment a few years ago called the Extended Theatre Experience. And what they were trying to see there is how can we create a representation of the theatre experience for people at home. We're all aware of, for instance, opera being streamed online, that you can watch an opera performance just by having a look at it online. With this experiment, they were trying to take it a step further and seeing how they can actually represent what it feels like to be in the theatre via the visual image. So they attached cameras to the actors, and they created a special play for that experience, and then they edited all of that together afterwards. I was able to actually see the imagery that they created, and I was astounded at how much it pulled on the best parts of action filmmaking, but at the same time gave me a sense of presence there that I wouldn't have just with a normal sort of streaming of the image online. But the nature of their work had to actually transform. The actors had cameras on them, and they sort of wanted to come up with a reason why the cameras were there, and they did the situating of the actors and the scenery for this work. So it changed the nature of the work. How it was being delivered out there changed the nature of the work at the beginning. So once again, distribution is not always just a meaningless channel, as we know, of course, with our years of research with Marshall McLuhan and so on. Another argument that was put forward in the early days was the no adaptation argument. And this is just a quote from Geoffrey Long's thesis, and it is something that Henry Jenkins put forward and many others as well. Once again, this was an important differentiation to help explain how transmedia was a different kind of storytelling. The idea was that if it was the same story being communicated in a different media, then that is not transmedia. A couple of years ago, when Henry gave his talk here, when he spoke about this, he did give a shout out to me and mentioned the fact that I have disputed this claim. Henry and I have been in discussions about this adaptation rule. So I just thought I would highlight one of the issues that we have when we say adaptation does not count. Here is an example of Darren Aronofsky's feature film, The Fountain, and he had a graphic novel that was created. Darren Aronofsky gave the graphic novelist Kent Williams a very early draft of the feature film script and a few props. And he said, go for it, do what you like with it. And so Kent did this sort of dramatic interpretation of the materials that he had. Darren then decided to release the graphic novel before the feature film, because that is the system that we're all used to. Comics, graphic novels being licensed, and now then there are feature film, and then perhaps even a television show. It's the natural progression that we're all aware of, and so that made sense to him. But there was a problem that a lot of his fans did not want to read the book first. His primary art form was the feature film. And so they were interested in reading the graphic novel, but the graphic novel was to be read second. And then on top of that, we have the thematics of The Fountain and what it is about. It is about reincarnation and the idea that the story can live in a lot of different forms, the same as the protagonists, means that the thought process of the story world is moving out beyond what is represented in the script to the actual medium there as well. Another example of an Australian work, which is once again a story about reincarnation. And with that one, the artist started with a book of poetry and then theatre. He created a dance film, a full dance feature film, and an experiential world in Second Life, the 3D world in Second Life. And with that, he consciously saw the work reliving itself and reinventing itself. It was actually a part of the meaning-making process. So once again, it's just an example of when the artist is trying to do something with it. It's, we cannot apply the rule universally. And we even have an example of Peter Greenaway and the fact that he did some VJing, so some live video mixing of his own transmedia project, the Tulsa Pool project. With that, he has the feature film. He had the specially made panel in which he had elements of the film which he would do a live remixing of for audiences. And he saw that as part of the work, as well as the exhibition and the art books that he has with the work, the multiple websites that he had with it, the games, all of that encompassed the work. So it wasn't just a case of distribution and an adaptation of the story. It's the same story. It's not when it actually moves across media. So another thing that happens, therefore, when you're working in transmedia is that you are suddenly hyper-aware of the affordances of media. You not only have a larger palette as a creator, you're not just working in one medium, or for instance, I only work in television, or I only work in print, in literature. Suddenly you have a choice. Well, will this story be expressed in a short film, or an animation, or a game? Or will it be all of them, and in what order? So the medium becomes part of the mini-making process, to the extent that a lot of creators working in this space see everything as a potential communication device. Here's just a shot of botanic halls, this device that you can use to have conversations with your plant. Your plant can send you messages and let you know when it's thirsty, for instance, and you can program it to say other things. For those of the creators who have been working in the alternate reality gaming space, we have a few here. That whole hyper-awareness of anything is possible is a part of the sort of the transmedia mindset. Another thing we saw in the early days of transmedia, and to some extent people who are coming into transmedia, is how could I say, a lack of personal storytelling, if you like, that you're creating stories that are there for a mass audience to be disseminated out there, which is important and that it has its place. But part of a maturity of an art form in an area is when people have different reasons for creating in the space. It's not just to reach more people. It is not just to potentially make more money. It could actually be for artistic purposes. It could be because there's something personal that you want to say. It could be that because you've been commissioned and someone's giving you some money. But a variety of starting points and a variety of focus around it. And I see a lot of parallels of what has been happening in gaming with what's been happening in transmedia, and I think there are lessons that can be learned from what's been happening in gaming that we can take on in transmedia as well. So for instance, here are some of the reasons, the rationales behind some alternate indie games that are out there. So, how can you achieve your dreams without pushing away the people you love, for instance, is a quote from one game. And when we're actually creating works that are starting from this space, one of the things you need to think about is how do I communicate this important message in all of the different modes that are possible. So we have our story, we have our art, we have our sound, we have our mechanics, our interactivity, if that's appropriate, and now also we have the medium. One of the ways that a particular work has got around this problem is by playing with the art and mechanics. This is an example from Journey, a multi-award-winning game that is very much an emotional game in which people who are playing that go through a very intense journey. There's virtually no text in the game at all, if any, if I can recall. There's no text. It's just wide open expanses. There's no way to verbalize any communication between the characters at all. And the creators managed to communicate a lot by switching between, these are some slides from Genova Chen's GDC talk, which is online. And the way they did it is they played with the hero's journey, but of course the hero's journey is now the player's journey. They played with the art and how the art can actually trigger the emotional point of where the player is at that time. and the sound, and they increased or decreased the mechanics according to how much the emotional state that they were trying to engender. So for instance, if they wanted you to feel tension, or that you're worried, anxious, that you're having trouble in some situation, then what you can do is reduced. And that was an interesting way of getting around that sort of problem. So this is something that, working as creatives in a particular medium of quality productions, where we're used to getting this gestalt where everything is coming together. But now in transmedia, we're trying to figure out how we can get that gestalt across all of the different media platforms. So I'll just borrow a concept to explore that idea further. Jesse Schell is a game designer who talks about the idea of an interest curve. That when you're creating interactive projects, that the people who are going through your project have different levels of interest. So they come in right at the very beginning with a whole lot of excitement about what it might be and what's going to be happening. And then their sort of interest will go down as they're finding out more information, and then we sort of move them up and down to a climax near the end, and then it's resolved. We can't have everyone's interest there all of the time. It's sort of a physical impossibility. But he talks about the way that you need to actually manipulate that interest curve consciously. And here's an example of an interest curve that is in unsuccessful experiences, where, of course, we're starting low, we're not getting that high, we might have a little peak, but then things are getting worse and worse. It makes us uncomfortable to see that. And what's interesting is that we need to then operate that across a whole lot of different media. So a transmedia interest curve. We have the levels of interest within the medium, but how do we actually make sure that that keeps progressing across the different media over time? And this is one of the questions that we have been dealing with in transmedia, and and part of the problem is release order, and then how much control you have over all of the elements, and so on. Another very early idea of transmedia was the idea of connections. I mean, transmedia is about the relationship between one thing and another at its essence. And so very much in the early days, the theories of intertextuality were brought in. And it was like, okay, well, transmedia is about intertextuality. And in media studies, we had a lot of writings on intertextuality. So, for instance, we had John Fiske talking about horizontal intertextuality, the relations between primary texts that are more or less explicitly linked, usually along the axes of genre, character, or content. And here they're talking about early franchises in the 1980s. So there we're saying, well, there's a same sort of fictional world, or the same characters that are happening across all of these properties. So we'll call that a horizontal intertextuality. But in narratology, we had a much earlier and stronger notion of intertextuality. Gerard Genet's study of transtextuality, in which Gerard Genet spoke about all of these different categories of intertextuality, paratextuality, metatextuality, architextuality, and hypertextuality. Hypertextuality is where the majority of all his categories are, and if you haven't had a look at the book, it's an amazing cookbook of all the things that you could do between media texts. Because he basically describes every single relationship that is possible. Oh, in this text, they reversed the order of these events that happened in this one. In this text, the character's gender has been flipped. In this text, and it basically lists every single one that's out there. Now, in academia, one of the things that we need to do, we thought we needed to do, is to make it clear the separation between this notion of intertextuality and transmedia and how it operates. And I went at length to do that. I spoke about how Gerard Genet's study is about the differences between texts between different creators. It was about different creators who were drawing on someone else's fictional world that is out there. And here's just a quote in which Gerard Genet actually says, well, if an author is actually continuing their own work, that doesn't really count. It should be counted at some point, but there's no hurry in doing that. It's not that interesting. And so he was specifically talking about that. So for me at the time, it was a case of, on the one hand, you have all of these categories and connections that operate in transmedia as well. But on the other hand, we have this phenomenon that they're describing, the phenomenon of someone creating a fictional world and then someone else doing something different with it. And that is a different phenomenon. And that's what I argued at the time. And it was interesting that, at the same time with Henry Jenkins and his great fan work, that we have, coming through that canon of fans doing something with someone else's IP, if you like, and changing the categories and doing all of these things. And so one of the things that we noticed was, well, everyone has been doing this across time except the original creators themselves. There have been other creators and there have been fans, except the original creators haven't been the ones that have been playing with their world or extending it as much. So that was an important distinction that was made at the time. Related to this, especially in the media studies intertextuality, was how this was conceived, early works were conceived, and for some still conceived as being all about marketing. The idea was that, especially in the early days, that anything outside of the main work, anything outside of a film, or a TV show, or a book, or whatever it is a paratext, is a text that's commenting on it. And usually that has a promotional function. And sometimes a critical function, but it's not actually part of the primary text at all. So the context of the media studies idea of intertextuality, we had things like the Tron game, the Tron arcade game, which could easily be seen as marketing, but if you are familiar with the Tron world, it was actually in the world that you played the game and then you went into the game. So it actually sort of made sense as a continuation of the world. But an important part of these theories was Marcia Kinder's entertainment supersystems. And she was looking at the phenomenon of children's television and how they were creating all of these television shows about these characters which were available for to be bought in the stores as toys. And then the feature films came out and the comics, and all of these were carefully constructed to sell all of these products. And on the plane over here, actually, I watched a documentary around the making of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I've seen a lot of posters around town here as well with the new feature film coming out. And what was interesting about the process, and I've studied it, but just watching the interviews with the creators, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles started... Is everyone familiar with the franchise? Yeah. It started off with a group of graphic novelists, and they created these comics, these graphic novels. They self-funded them. They thought it would just be a bit of fun. They came up with the idea where they were watching television and sort of riffed off each other. They self-funded a production line of 3,000 graphic novels, and it sold out very quickly. And then they took orders, and suddenly they had orders for 15,000, and then it just skyrocketed immediately. And then they were called up by a licensing manager who said, "This looks interesting. I would like to take on your property and get some some models made, some figurines made. And that was a dream for the graphic novelists, because the idea of creating these characters which are then created in form. And so they signed that agreement, and Playmates came on board, and they designed the figurines for the property. But then they realized that they needed something more to actually sell the figurines. They needed to get the content appealing to children more rather than adults. The graphic novels were more adult targeted. And so then they decided to actually create an animated series, a short animated series of 5 episodes to create the backstory of the world and give a reason for buying the figurines. And that worked. And what was interesting with the people that worked on the figurines, there was some discussion with the original artist, but they were basically working in their area. The animation was written by another gentleman, David Wise, who helped develop the backstory of the world. There was some discussion with the original creators, but they were basically left to themselves. And that was the context of connections between media at the time. You license it. You're not part of the creative process. You give permission for someone else to use it in return for some money. And you weren't necessarily interested into how it actually plays out. And that was a great success, but this is the context of Marcia Kinder's work. And she was looking at these, and it's like how they were constructed for commercial success. But it went a bit too far, this rule of anything across media is all about franchising. Because, for instance, we had some creators who were talking about anything that's across and around a whole lot of different media is just about commodification. And they even went so far as to draw in Twin Peaks and said all of the books that are in Twin Peaks are an example of a commodification of the form. And if any of you are familiar with David Lynch, you will know that that would not be part of his ideology at all. And in fact, and the books were a playful sort of experiment between Mark Frost and David Lynch, but mainly Mark Frost. And yeah, it was not meant for marketing at all. So once again, we have this idea of this rule, this way of seeing things that needs to be updated. And that was part of the movement of the early definitions of transmedia, to highlight what was special and unique about this, because as a lot of my colleagues are aware, we would go to events and over again we were sort of told, oh, this is just distribution, or this is just marketing. It's as if that's not important in itself, which it is, but it was frustrating because it would say, well, no, there's actually something else going on here. And so the predominant conversation that came in was about, it's not this, it's not that, in order to sort of shape what it is for other people. And what I find interesting looking back over that time and over those conversations is that I don't think any of us working in the space ever had any doubt what it was. It was more about getting other people to understand it. So the function of those conversations is more about for other people rather than for ourselves. And defining it for ourselves. I'll be interested in your thoughts on that, if anyone's got some comments. So here we have the Tulsapur suitcases once again, and how Peter Greenaway went and explored all of these. We also have Trent Reznor and the work that he did with his Year Zero alternate reality game that surrounded his album, and how he was criticised by a lot of his fans for doing a marketing campaign. And so, how could you do this? It's not marketing. And Trent Reznor was saying, it's not marketing, it is the album. And this is something that these conversations come up over and over again. So the idea is that anything outside of the work is outside. But what we're saying is, well, it's not necessarily outside. It can actually be a part of it. So at the time I looked at intermediate art I thought, okay, we've got all these media studies views of how it's operating. I'll go and look at art history and see what sort of conversations they have had about the relationship between things. And I found an affinity with intermediate art, with Dick Higgins, and a lot of his discussions about what was different about intermediate art. One of the important things that he said was that intermediate art and people who are working in intermediate art are about bringing together things that have been artificially separated. It's like, oh, you can't have a painting that's mixed with sculpture. Can't have these two concepts together. And intermediate artists were the ones that were actually playing with this area. And for him, he went to the extent, and this is a picture from a paper by Hannah Higgins discussing the work, and he said, this is an example of an intermediate artwork. We have bits of musical notes that are there, so we have the art and craft of music coming in. We have visual design because it's all laid out there, and we have a bit of poetry in there as well. And these different forms are coming together to create a new work. And that is the nature of intermediate art, when they're combined together in this force. Now, at the time, in my critical academic mind, I said, well, yes, the higher level abstraction of bringing things together that are artificially separated, that's what transmedia is about. But we don't combine things to that extent. You know? We keep them separate. The media cannot be combined at all. But once again, I see some interesting works that are being done, which I see are in one medium. So, for instance, they're just online, but they're combining lots of different things, and they are using a whole lot of transmedia writing, or what I would consider transmedia writing and transmedia design skills. Yet technically, I can't call that transmedia, and so this is when I question the function of these sorts of distinctions. I think at the time they were important, but I think now we can be a bit more playful. So one of the things over the years is looking at transmedia and what it is. The thing that has been of interest to me is how it changes the way we create as practitioners. So my PhD was about the practitioner perspective and what's different there. And I found a lot of assistance with semiotics and how they sort of describe practices and understand meaning through practice. And some of the interesting things that I've found in the last few years is the relationship, for instance, between image and sound. So in an audio work that I've created, which this is a sneak peek of the Chrome browser version, which I'm about to release. My intuition was that as soon as you have some abstract imagery, like line drawing and animation, that sits very comfortably with a lot of interesting sound design. That you can do very interesting things there, and that was my intuition. And I didn't have a reason for it, but that's what I have felt it would work. And so with this piece, I made sure I had these sort of static illustrations that with all of these sort of complex audio on top of it, so they could work together. Later on, I found a theory by a psychologist in which he talks about how as soon as we have all of these different media channels competing for our attention, they sort of cancel each other out. And so it sort of made sense there where you have a primary channel of audio, for instance, and that's tempered with lesser visual. And so they don't cancel each other out, they actually work to complement each other. One of the things I'm interested in is what's the relationship between that and the cumulative effect of transmedia over time? Does this actually relate? It does when it comes to the two-channel simultaneous media usage stuff. That's definitely a part of the issue there. But over time, is there something that happens over time in terms of the cumulative effect? And I don't think we've really answered that question yet. I've also noticed that in gaming, there's been a lot of discussion based on what is a game and what isn't. This relates to our conversation about transmedia. In the very early days of the development of ludology, There were a lot of debates and important discussions out there explaining what is a game, what is the nature of the game. Because the problem was that narrative theorists were saying you can actually analyze this work via the theories and the methods that we have. And people working in games were saying, no, there's not a direct correlation. They're not exactly the same. It's a very different phenomenon. And so they spent a long time basically saying a game is different because it's this. But what's happened is that we now have a purist sort of essentialism of the only thing that is a game is this one element, and anything else that's with it corrupts it. It ruins it. It reduces it. And this causes problems in education, it causes problems in culturally out there, and even further. It's something that I don't quite understand, because there is the understanding that you need audio and great audio design to make something work, but if you add story with a game, apparently the whole thing explodes. But this has had a very detrimental effect. And this is where I think we have a responsibility when we're having these discussions about definitions and about rules and what makes something good and what makes something doesn't. Doesn't make something good. That it can have a flow-on effect culturally over time. So one of the things I posited in my thesis was that perhaps there's this other dimension that connects both narrative and games together. That we have a narrative mode, we have a game mode, an interactive sort of mode, or specifically a game mode, but there are things that are the same between them that we can actually unify. And this was actually, there was some initial work by Espen Arseth and Marco Escalenen, who were playing with this idea of what translates and what doesn't across media. And now when I look at the interactive storytelling sort of pieces that I'm doing, I do see a lot of correlations. So for instance, if you work in narrative, you work in writing, I see a lot of what we do is we construct this very delicate system of interreactions between all of these elements. This character has a history with this character. This character is in love with this character, and this character wants to kill that character, and that character knows about it, and this one doesn't, and it just keeps going. And that's how we make it work. We work very hard to make this system up of these relationships. And the audience interprets that in their head, and they take guesses about where it will be going and all of that. But then as soon as we get to the interactive or to the game mode, suddenly it's not all of these perfect characters that we've constructed specifically for this structure that can't be moved. Suddenly we have a player that's part of that system. And we have to figure out, they're not going to stay still. They're not going to keep the same motivation that we've constructed for all the other characters. They're a movable target in some way. But it still is a carefully crafted system. And both of them operate in a very similar way. So we have the idea of the hero's journey then playing out to the player's journey, and how we can make that happen. And one of the things from screenplays is this idea of what do they want and what do they need. When you're designing characters, you think about what they want and what they need, and both of those are in conflict with each other. But when we're actually including a player within that dynamic, we have to try and guess what it is or what they need, or do we? And this is what I found interesting is where I am at the moment is it's about using the same manipulations that we use between characters, but we're just applying them to another person. I'll give an example. One of the things that David Freeman talks about in his book on emotioneering, which is I think a great book if you're interested in looking at interactive writing. And he talks about the relationship between player characters and non-player characters and how you can get them to form attachments with each other. So for instance, put the non-playing character, the other character in the game, in danger. And so the player suddenly feels the need to actually help them out. Or they both have a shared enemy, so they immediately feel some bonding with each other. That the non-playing character sacrifices something for you as a player. And so suddenly you feel a bit beholden to them, or you've bonded, because of that. And what I find interesting is these are all techniques that we use just in writing between characters in general, and we create empathy in the audience relating to what is happening. But we still just apply the same thing, but now with the player. I'll go into one last area here, because I realise I'm nearing the end of my time. One of the things that is spoken about in terms of the awakening that a writer goes through when they're working across different media and the affordances of each media is this idea that when you're moving from being a novelist, for instance, in which you're writing everything down, you have to communicate everything that is happening in the world with your words. And then suddenly, if you go to the visual medium, you've been told to show, don't tell. That, okay, you can stop writing everything down. Someone else will be communicating a lot of what's happening. There's the setting, there's the framing that's happening, there's the sound design, there's the acting. All of these will be communicating a whole lot. And there's often criticism for writers, not doing that. But I think one of the things is when you're coming from this space where you're responsible for communicating everything, and then suddenly you go into a collaborative environment in which quite often, especially in the interactive world, you're not invited to the very end to be a part of it, or you're not even part of the discussions of what we're going to communicate through all of these different modes, then it's understandable that they're trying to shoehorn a whole lot, via text. But the other awakening is, we move into the interactive realm, is the idea of do, don't tell. So we're not just showing anymore, we're getting meaning through what the player does. So the player understands what they're communicating via their actions. And this is another literacy we're adding on top to our palette of different ways that we can create meaning. And this is where there's an overlap between how we create for performance in film and television, theatre, and in games. In a novel, you're writing everything with these perfect characters, but as soon as you're writing for performance, where you're handing over some of your text to someone else, the same also applies to games. But there's something that I've realised over the last few years, or more recently, with regards to how we write for these sorts of characters. One of the things that we're taught as interactive storytellers is that interactive writing is about branches, that we have these branches of choice. And so as soon as, let's say you have one choice of will you kill that person or won't you? And if you say yes, then that takes you onto this other path, and there's all these other choices, and it just keeps ballooning out. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have these branching narratives in a lot of projects, is because that's a whole lot of work and resources to actually create. But that's the paradigm that we're often told is the way to create. And I found it fascinating and interesting to work in. But I found myself going back to an early intuition that I had about interactive writing. And this is from a few talks that I've seen. This is a talk from Elan Ruskin, who works at Valve, a gaming company. And he spoke about the sort of interactive dialogue systems that they create for their writers there. And what they do is they design an environment where the writers create responses to anything that is happening at any time. So you walk into a room, if I walked in here now, I could write responses for if any of you said something to me. And then I could sort of pre-code, I could pre-write in some responses of, what would I say to looking at that bottle? What would I say to looking at this microphone? So it's not a pre-written linear sequence of everything that's happening there. It's contextual based on all of the environment that's around. But then the system also has memory, and it remembers some of the things you've said, and it remembers some of the things you've done. And so if you go to another part of the game and you have a conversation with a character, they will, you know, have that context, and they'll refer to things that you've done before. So it's sort of disengaging it from the branching and just creating these moments of interaction between all of these characters and agents and bits that are happening there. And this reminded me of my early work in chatbots. So that was my first sort of personal exploration of interactive storytelling, was using the artificial intelligence markup language, AliceBot, many years ago. And with that, you basically sort of program quite easily the conversations that you have between characters. And so you basically say, oh, the person asked this and you respond this, but you think of any possible key word that the person could enter in, and then you come up with responses of that character. So with that, I felt as if I was designing a character with a way of seeing the world, as opposed to writing specific events. Very different way of conceptualizing the design of the character. And it's interesting that just last year, I was actually commissioned to write a speech for this android. Android is the one sitting down. The gentleman over at the top is Professor Hiroshi Ishiguro, and he's created these Geminoids. This is a Geminoid HI4, and this Geminoid was brought over to Australia to give a speech and to introduce all of these performing robots that were happening. So I was commissioned to write the speech for the robot to introduce the other robots. And right then, I realized that I needed to create an environment, to create a worldview of the robot where the robot is aware of its lack of humanness and how it could communicate, that through the language. And I think this is part of the playful, interesting stuff that we have ahead of us. And if I'd followed the rules of interactive storytelling in terms of branching narratives, then I would sort of lose out on this really interesting, playful path that is happening. If we stuck by the rules of adaptation and repurposing, then we wouldn't have seen those other works and the possibilities of understanding that you could do whatever you like, and you can use a medium for whatever you like. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about today. The message that I wanted to say today is that I think it's important to have these conversations about what it is, and but that has a function for a particular point in time, that to allow yourself to create whatever you darn well please in any way, whether it fits a category or not. And I think then we will see some really interesting works coming out from there. So thank you. I'll end there. Any questions?
Si alguien tiene una pregunta, creo que ahora es el momento.
If you have any questions now, please, this is the right moment for them.
Is that better? Yeah. So with the branching narrative, it's something that many writers, particularly first time, they understand it because they get like a choose your own adventure story and this type of thing. With the other type of writing you're describing, is there like a documentation format that people can use? Because I think without the tool, or without being able to visualize that type of storytelling, it becomes a problem for people to take their writing in that direction.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason why we create these processes and ways of doing things. And you're well aware of the power of documentation and how it can help others move into the area. I just think it's a sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, what happens is then we create a process or a way of doing things, which then gives us a particular output every time. You know, it's a system of producing which produces a very similar output. And I think that, you know, for me, over time, I've been looking back and it's like, well, I didn't have to do it that way. I think it was important for me to learn that, you know, it's the old thing of learn the rules and then you know, play, you know, do the reverse or whatever. But I don't think we necessarily have to go through the hard-worn paths every time. But you're right, it's not for everyone. You know, there are also people that want to understand it and know it. But there are others that are quite comfortable running through the bush with no paths, sort of thing. And I guess I'm one of those people that's quite comfortable, you know, in that terrain. But I do feel pulled towards going through what everyone else seems to be doing. Because it's like, well, then I think there's some lesson to be learned there. But I think at times I do that to the detriment of actually doing something that is true to my creativity. So I don't know if that was a meta answer. Yeah.
Hi, Christy. Just going back to that interest curve of yours that you showed.
Jesse Shell's.
Yeah,
yes.
Not yours, but the one you showed, because it was quite concerning, the one that showed the disinterested audience. So what do you reckon are the most important things now to keep the interest? Is it the story still? Is it the audience engagement strategy, long tail thinking, or is it all dependent upon which project you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's different contexts because you have a different makeup of different modes each time. But pacing is important, you know, and that's one of the things we spoke about in the early days of transmedia as well, is this pacing within the form, but there's pacing also across all the different forms too. And that was one of the important points about the interest curve, is you can't have everyone's attention peaking all the time. You know, give people breaks. And so pacing is a part of it. One thing I have found personally is that if I as a creator and everyone on my team is enjoying the project and continuing to enjoy the project, then that usually follows through outside as well. That you need to actually live the excitement internally to get some idea of, you know, how it works. It's not a universal rule. There are some people who have had great times on projects and they love it, and then it's just fallen, you know, the reverse. But I think that's an important part of it as well. But yeah, it's all about this is part of your intuition of taste. Of course, with testing as well, you know, putting it in front of people and seeing how they respond. But what you bring up and what you bring down, I think, is, you know, part of the skills and dependent on the project. As I said, with pacing, you know, in some interactive projects, you need to have times where the player isn't doing anything, to physically have a break, but also mentally, if you want them to be reflecting on things, then that can't happen when you go. Yeah, so there's some things there. Do you have thoughts?
I totally agree with everything you just said.
Okay. Sure. Any other questions or statements? Yep. Hello, the lady that came with us in the elevator.
Yeah. My name is Maria Luisa Moreo. I'm a social media expert, and I'm wondering for the last few years how social media has changed completely the world in every single way, particularly with marketing, creative writing, and so on. And my question is, where would transmedia be without social media, and where it will be in the future?
What will it be?
Yeah.
Transmedia. What is it going to go towards?
I mean, how it will move.
I think, what does the future of transmedia look like? That's the question, yes. And this is where I think I'm trying to do an interventionist moment here, where I think we're on a path of that we can have some good productions that are doing the right things in terms of user experience and interactivity, and there's high production values, and the team actually has some money, and the team actually has some time, and that's great. But I also want to see at the same time people that are breaking the rules, that are sort of, you know, that's not transmedia, you know, and it's okay. There are things that are happening on the fringe that are challenging and in bringing in new ideas, and at the same time, you know, hopefully more of a variety of interesting and personal stories. We're seeing a lot of interesting things happening, I think, in the documentary and the non-fiction realm in transmedia. Some meaningful stuff happening there, but I'd like to see, yeah, some more personal tales. We have a lot more practitioners now that have skills in more than one area, and so hopefully, yeah, there'll be more support for those to actually create other productions. In terms of other sort of predictions, yes, well, we can see more productions, I think, around television. I think that will continue, although you may disagree, Simon, we'll see. But I think with a lot of the interest and the market interest in television, we can see more productions around that. I would love to see more interactive productions around television for adults, not just for children and youth. But we're seeing what's interesting for those who have worked in alternate reality gaming and pervasive gaming, you know, as it was called, it's been superseded already. So what's interesting is that the gaming world has the local multiplayer scene. So local multiplayer games are a way of reframing the idea of playing with friends. And so those of us in alternate reality gaming, we used to call it pervasive gaming, you know, it's people in the streets and they're together. But I guess that term was not pervasive. It stayed in a particular area, and now the gaming world has actually a different terminology for describing this area. So I think we'll see more of that, like the movement of it being adopted or reframed or arising in other communities and cultures, you know, outside of what we've been familiar with. Thank you. Okay.
Hi. Have you found that the word transmedia is being understood outside this room, or is it still causing more problems than it is helping with?
Yeah, on the one hand, there is a greater understanding. It's a shorthand now, which is great, which is part of the reason why a lot of us just decided to adopt the term, because it was for the good of the form. Excuse me. But there are still a lot of people that don't understand or use it. But they're usually not. They're usually early career or fans. So I think, you know, professionals working in the area usually at least understand the notion, if not the terminology. But I see conversations over and over again, which is part of the reason why I'm saying this here, is that, you know, oh, this is what it is, and you know, this is what we have to do. And as I said, I see that as having a role, but I think it also sets us on a particular trajectory, which I'm not quite sure on the outcome. I don't think it's the most ideal outcome. So I'd like to see more jazz in that regard.
Hi, Christine. Thank you very much for an amazing presentation. I would like just to mention something that I think is getting more and more important in the last years. Is games for change, serious games. This opportunity that the games are opening for more immersive experiences and collaborative co-working. How do you find, from your experience in Australia and the academic and professional world, that is going to be expanding in the next years?
Games for Change, I guess, has a similar thing that's happened with some cases with transmedia, in that you know, it's been identified with a certain area and a certain approach, and there are reframings that are happening to make sure that it actually moves out of that area. So one thing that I'm interested in is the deep game movement, or personal gaming movement, in which you're creating games with a purpose other than pure entertainment, which is the original idea of serious games. But it's not necessarily identifying with training games or games for products or anything like that. It's identifying with a different subset and trying to highlight that, because I think the Games for Change area has it's an important area, but it's been focusing on the economic interest of products and training and those sorts of purposes. So, and there's a bit of an overlap with political games and things like that. But that's what I'm seeing, and how there's another outreach that has emerged in consequence to that. And we don't have as much of the deep games happening in Australia. For some reason, we have a strong mobile gaming movement, which is quite successful, but and I think part of it is perhaps the lack of institutional support in terms of funding, which is changing. And having the outlets for getting to audiences, which is a part of it as well. Showcases, competitions, and journalists and criticism. And as I said, the same thing in transmedia as well. That's why I see a lot of parallels and things that we can take lessons from either side. We're still waiting on some more criticism, artistic criticism in transmedia, which I think would help the area. Yeah. We have one over here as well. Yeah. You're the filler.
Hi. It seems that we always thought that we need an end to a story to get a meaning, to understand what the story was about. But we are moving from stories, for close stories, to sandbox. And then what happens to this finding a sense of the story?
Yeah, and I think that relates to my comment about writing for contextual and just writing in response to things that are happening, as opposed to a preset amount of events that then end at a particular point. It's not about all creation should go in this direction. We're still going to have the whole gamut, most definitely, but the open world, sort of approach is quite interesting. And even in small scale productions in which you're just walking around an island, for instance, there's or other ones, there are projects that are being produced which are not necessarily about having a particular ending. And I think this is the influence of the art scene and the installation works, which is mixing in with the narrative works. And so, this relates to what Dick Higgins was saying earlier on in the late 1960s, saying that the most interesting artists are the intermediate ones. They're the ballerinas that are hanging out with the filmmakers, and they're creating really interesting stuff. And so this is when we can create new models. Oh, there isn't an ending. Oh no, there is, but it's over there. Yeah. I think that's.
Hi, I'm trying to make myself clear because I don't speak much English. So what you just said about the authors, that they really weren't the responsibles for the expansion of their fictional works, that they really don't experiment that much. That's almost true. That it is true that, for example, for the early transmedia fictions, what I'm talking about is about, for example, Sherlock Holmes, or these type of works that really expand because of the fans' actions. And now it is still important that part where the fans engage and expand the world. But my question is, do you think that now it is more important the role of the authors, because, well, there is no one. There is not only one author of a transmedia fiction world. Now we have a lot of people collaborating with these creations. We have different professionals from different industries. So now I think that maybe there is, of course, fun actions are still important to these creations. They will always be. But now I think that maybe the author's creation, design of these words are being more important. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, yes, it's more of a collaborative, and there are different ways of executing a good collaboration, you know, and it depends on the people on the team and whether they're there together at the beginning. I think giving, just as you have on your own collaborative projects, let alone in transmedia ones, giving everyone a sense of ownership is really important. So they're more likely to do really interesting stuff if they feel an ownership of it. And for me personally, I think I try and get as many ideas in as possible, and I don't care if the programmer is coming up with a good, you know, art idea or a gag. If it makes the project better, then you know, I don't care what the source is. I don't need to be the only source of its execution. But yes, at the same time, what I find is that the ones that make the process easier is when they have skills across more than one role. So if they have an understanding of the way art works, or if they have an understanding of the way another medium works. So they understand filmmaking as well as game producing. And that makes the process a lot easier because you're not spending the whole time trying to explain things. You have some shared language. That's one of the obstacles to transmedia, is that lack of shared language and processes. So this is where the most important skill set is more and more people that have the skills across those mediums. So it's not about that one person doing it all. It's about a whole lot of people having a common language. And that's what I'm finding the most important within a project. So for instance, if programmers that understand user experience, it's gold. It just shortens a whole lot of the production process because you don't have to explain the reason why that box does not work there. And yeah, it works in the transmedia world. So different forms of collaboration, and I think it's interesting to have sort of more auteur-driven works, but they're not auteur ones. So, you know, a bit of variety there. I hope that answers a bit of your question. Yeah. We can talk more.
Thank you.
Hi, hello, good morning.
Hello.
In line to what you said, do you think that any entertainment product or any kind of production now needs to be transmedia in order to be successful? Or there would be any authors, now that the lady behind me has opened up the discussion, that would deliberately steer away from transmedia and would make things that are not transmediable or translatable. I am thinking of a very old example, the one by Alan Moore, when he said that he wrote Watchmen as a deliberately adaptable to the movies because he hated the medium. He thought that they had made a total mess of his previous work, and actually then Watchmen was adapted. I know it's not transmedia exactly, but it was adapted, and it was, I would say, quite successfully for such a different work and different work. So do you think that there would be some sort of, I don't know, artistic cachet in saying, no, my work cannot be expanded?
There could only be one, yes. Yes, there were definitely, especially those of us in the early days, we would be sent, for instance, a film script and asked to transmedify it, and it was quite difficult because everything was neatly closed off. You know, all of the relationships, all of the questions, everything was resolved, and so it was, you know, difficult to sort of expand and parlay that out unless you were deciding to radically reverse everything and turn it around, which of course they didn't want. So there are definitely works that are not amendable to transmedia, and that's part of why there is a skill set to it, to writing something, to designing something, to conceiving something that actually works. It's the same with writing a episodic project, whether it's a book or, a TV show or something, episodic has its particular systems that make it easier and better, recurring characters, changing locations, all of that. So there are things that don't mix well with transmedia. There are some projects in which I say, I don't think you should do transmedia because you're not really interested in exploring or it's bringing the world out. You just want to, potentially bring more audiences in or something like that. You can still do interesting stuff with that impetus, but oftentimes the heart and the desire to put time into it is not there. So I think, but at the same time, to answer the other question, no, everything does not have to be transmedia. I think part of what I'm saying is diversity. Do whatever you feel like, and if you just want to do one production, that is fine. And in fact, I struggled with that with some of my projects. My next game, which is coming out, it has two ways of experiencing it. I just can't help it. I try and stop myself doing that, but it's just sort of naturally there. But at the same time, I have not engaged in creating a major work that will be, unfolding over months or years, because that will take a whole lot of time and energy, which I don't have for that at the moment. So even transmedia people don't do transmedia.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay. I can speak to anyone afterwards as well, but thank you very much again for listening. I look forward to having any conversations with you that you may want to discuss. That was a bit of a recursive sentence, but thank you again for the invite, and look forward to hearing from Simon and the rest of the crew. Thank you.
Os quería tener castigados sin café una hora más, pero me dicen que no, que hay que hacer más.
I'm sorry, we'll have to. So we're going to have a pause, half an hour pause. I'd like to keep you all without coffee for an hour, but let's get to know each other and exchange ideas. And we'll be back in half an hour right here. Thank you.